Hello and welcome back to The Great Game, an Australian megagames podcast. It's been a while, but we're extremely happy to be back in the saddle. How you doing, Pat?
I am doing great. Looking forward to the end of the year and doing plenty of mega game related stuff. So I'm excellent. How are you, Jack?
Absolutely fantastic as well. Thank you for asking. Awesome. Well, this episode we will be talking to Tony about his game Gods of the Ancient World. But first, just some news quickly. One big thing that has popped up this year is Adelaide Mega Games, who have gotten started with some awesome games with God Emperor and Watch the Skies running this year. Highly recommend if you are interested and in that area that you check them out. We'll have the links to their Discord and things like that in the description. Melbourne Mega Games have, of course, been having an absolutely bumper year with two runs of So Say We All, two runs of Phase Anatomy, Crisis in Elysium in January. So they continue to go off, obviously. And yeah, Sydney Mega Games has been doing amazing, Pat. Yeah, with runs of God Emperor and the Ark. And so tons of mega gaming stuff happening. For me, on my side in Brisbane, I have been more focused on a video game that I'm planning to release early 2024. It's called The Thief, the Witch, the Toad, and the Mushroom, and it's a very spooky, folklorish visual novel about an old book that you find and discover mysterious secrets within. Very excited to get that out there. We'll include a link in the description if you're interested in wishlisting it on Steam. But very interested and excited to get that out in the world and get back to more mega gaming stuff in Brisbane.
And yeah, I know that you've been working on that for a while now. It is on my wish list. I'm keeping an eye on it. And I think that you also had
Thank you, Pat.
some
That's great.
mega game community designers help with some of the playtesting of that. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. That's right. I've been getting some members. So if you are interested, please check out the Brisbane Mega Games Discord and give me a ping. And yeah, happy to get any playtesting I can get for it.
Awesome. Looking forward to that one. I've also been pretty busy this year. In the game world, we have obviously been running a few events in Sydney. Kicked off the second half of the year. Personally, I haven't been doing a lot in the mega game space. Been really excitedly sort of handing some of that back over to other members of the Sydney community, which is awesome. But I have been indulging my design mind with some new hobbies. Most probably interestingly and in a roundabout way connected to mega games is probably game books. I've been delving into game books several decades late and having an awesome time. It's really interesting some of the stuff that people are publishing these days. Very complex systems for just a book that you're flipping around. And I have also, thank you to others in the mega game community here in Sydney, I have just dipped my toe into Kriegspiel online, which is just a whole other rabbit hole that I'm not gonna go down right now. But it's been awesome, and it's generating a lot of design juices, getting them flowing for me. So that's been really good. So it has been a busy year. We've both been pretty busy with lots of things, but unfortunately not a huge amount of podcasting. Something that we are hoping to amend in the new year. We are looking forward to recording and bringing you more podcast in the new year. We don't want to sort of overcommit too much or give too much away, but we have lined up some interviews, some subjects that we want to tackle with different people from around the world, and we really want to get back into a bit of a regular swing of recording and bringing you these conversations because I think they are really, really useful. That said, we really want to hear from you. So if you are interested in joining the podcast, talking to us about something, if there's someone you think that we should reach out to and talk to, any mega games that you think we need to analyze, or just any questions that you'd like to have us answer with other designers or just from ourselves, let us know. You can get in touch with us through our individual mega game identities, I suppose, and we've also got the Discord and the Facebook page for the Great Game, so there'll be all links to all of that stuff in the description. All of that said and done, is there anything else from you, Jack, before we jump into this conversation with Tony?
No, I think that's it. I definitely want you to send me some of those game book recommendations, though, because I would love to check those out.
I could do a whole other episode talking about game books, and if we just somehow connect them to mega games, I'm sure people will love it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Let's do it.
That's us. That's our plans for the new year. We are leaving you with a couple of episodes. The first one, this one, is with Tony from the Dukes of Highland. We go into a lot about Tony's journey through the mega game world and how he ended up designing this game, Gods of the Ancient World. So I will leave all of the details for the podcast. Let's get to it.
And hello, I'm here with Tony from the Dukes of Highland, and Pat, of course. How you doing, Tony?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for coming on. How have things been? How you doing? And how's megagaming treating you?
We had a great year. We ran about 4 games this year, and I got to play one. I got to play, and then I got to control one as well. So this year feels like things are starting to get back to normal here in the States after the pandemic. So it's all good.
Fantastic. I'm so glad to hear it. Yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your history with mega games and yeah, what the Dukes of Highland is all about.
Yeah, but glad to. So my name is Tony Doherty. I am originally a Brit, as you can tell, although I live in the States these days. I've been over here about 16 years. I am part of the goddamn class, as most people seem to be, which is finding it through the Shut Up and Sit Down website
Yes.
and their video. Yep. And played my first game in 2018. Played another, that was Watch the Skies. I played Den of Wolves in 2019. Then we had a big old pandemic that hit the world. And then I decided, coming out of the pandemic, that there were not enough gaming groups going on, and it was time to start one myself. So I convinced a bunch of my friends to help me with a version of Watch the Skies. And we ran that in March of 2022. So that was last year. And it was really successful. And it was a big learning curve, of course, because putting on a mega game is hard work. But that was really good. And then we ran the same thing again at Gen Con of August last year. So that was last year, 2022.
Awesome. So how have you found, yeah, coming out of the pandemic and getting things back together and kicking things off again?
Yeah, so I was about ready to run the game when Omicron hit. But I was lucky enough that we were just past Omicron, and so people were just starting to get back into doing public things. And that was March, as I said. So, it seemed like the local community here was ready to do sort of geeky events, and mega games fit in perfectly. Of course, not many people have heard of mega games, so that was quite a challenge, finding 40 odd players to play when most of Louisville had no idea what a mega game was. So that was a lot. I had to do a lot of Facebook and Discord and Reddit and posters up around town advertising, and that is my least favorite part of this hobby, is the advertising. When I put those tickets up, I stress for the next 2.5 months trying to fill up my games.
Oh, wow.
I've not had any major problems, but that doesn't stop the stressing, of course.
Has that become easier after you ran the first one? Has it just naturally
absolutely
snowballed? Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say snowballed exactly, but it's definitely become easier, though I still stress. I've got my sort of email list now that sort of grows every time we run something, and I can, starting to create a community on Discord as well, and I've got strong connections to the Mega Game Coalition over here.
Awesome.
So yeah, things are getting easier.
Good. That's good. And I'm really curious when we're talking to other groups. I mean, since that first game in 2022, have you found? Do you have sort of the same faces coming along to every game that you run?
We have a handful of the same faces come to everyone, and what I don't know what it's like in Australia, but over here it always blows my mind how far people are willing to travel. There's the people that know mega games, and because there are so few gaming groups over here in the States these days, I've had people travel like 12 hours to come and play our games. That's uncommon, of course. Most people are pretty local, but 4 hours is pretty common. And I get a group that come all the way from Michigan, and they've come to every single one of our games. But even so, even with those like in quotes hardcore mega gamers, when I do my pre-game surveys and post-game surveys, I always get about above 70% new players every time we run. It's very different at Gen Con, but for local games, it's quite high new players. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I think that's a similar trend over here, at least in Sydney. It's been we've run 3 events this year, the second half of this year, and it was really vast majority of new players at each one, which was really awesome. Interested to talk to you about the con experience as well, but before we get waylaid, I suppose if you started off in early last year with Watch the Skies, started building the crowd, at what point did you decide you were going to start designing your own games out of the Dukes label?
Yeah, it was about early summer last year, so pretty quickly after I'd run Watch the Skies. I must have had an old copy of Watch the Skies. I found it very difficult to take that package and run it. So I talk about this on my blog, and we can link to that later. But essentially, I was designing to fill the gaps. I was not comfortable running a game that I wasn't 100%. I didn't know all the rules and that kind of stuff. And because I'd never run something before, I needed to know this game inside and out. So I did a lot of redesign for some of the Watch the Skies elements. And then coming off that, it felt like, well, we'd done so much design for Watch the Skies that it was just an obvious next step to start something from scratch that was my own. And that's where my game came from.
Awesome. Well, speaking of your game, why don't you tell us about it? What's it about? What inspired it?
Well, it's called Gods of the Ancient World. It is a ancient Roman, ancient Greek faction versus faction game to some extent, set in a fictionalized 300 BC. The Romans face off against the Greeks, which did not happen historically, not in this not to this size anyway. And so we sort of taken some history and tweaked it a little bit. It was heavily influenced by Watch the Skies, of course, because that was the one I knew the best. And from a theme perspective, like I wanted something that was in the popular culture. And so when you think about what is going to have mass appeal, there's zombies and there's high school stuff and there's sci-fi and fantasy and that kind of stuff, and those are all great and fine, but I have some very strong memories of watching things like Jason and the Argonauts and a little the Trojan horse myth and the movie 300 and the Roman Senate and Minotaurs and the Labyrinth and all those great things mixed together. And I thought that would make for an amazing theme. And so many people have had some exposure to an element of that. I know there's entire classes that people do in high school over here based on classic history, but just popular culture. I wanted something that was sort of had a wide appeal that I could be passionate about, because it's so important when you're going to spend so much time developing something that you have to be into it. So that was where the theme came from, certainly.
Absolutely. How often would you say you think about the Roman Empire, Tony?
These days, not a lot.
Oh, okay.
I've tried to put it behind me because it's a passion project, but by the end of it, you're like, gosh, I'm so done with it.
I'm sick of the Roman Empire. That's reasonable.
That's right. But yeah, it was. I thought about the Greeks and the Romans and their gods all the time for like 12 months straight. So yeah.
That's fair. So how did those early how did that early design work go when you were kind of getting started with making stuff using that template from Watch the Skies? What were your first steps there, and how did that part of it go?
Yeah, so it's true that I did use a similar template to Watch the Skies because that's what I knew. And so um, it made me think about what makes a team. And in a mythical setting like this, based on history, you have a governor, you have someone that controls the army, some kind of commander, you have a senator. Of course, you can't have a game about the Roman Empire without a senate. You have someone that manages resources and the people and making sure there's food and water and that kind of stuff. There and also I wanted a strong connection to the gods because of course the Greeks had this set of gods and the Romans basically copy pasted those gods. So I liked the idea that they were the same gods just with different names. And the way that you would communicate with those gods are via a priest, and the gods represent like in quotes the aliens from Watch the Skies. But I wanted to make sure that connection between the gods and the humans was a lot tighter. I found whilst the aliens do drive the story somewhat in Watch the Skies, sometimes it feels like you have no idea what they're doing, and some people don't really have any interaction with them. And I wanted to make sure that everybody had some interaction with the gods.
How did you when you started putting pen to paper, setting wise and sort of building up the world and the characters, like the roles, that kind of thing? How did you grapple with the tug and pull of making a very approachable, you know, game of the right complexity versus all of the stuff that you know about history and how everything worked and how complex it all was? Was that difficult, or did it come quite naturally to you?
I am not a historian. Um, so for me, I know that there are some designers out there that just love history and they want to replicate that and they want to do things about the Cold War and this sort of obscure battle from 1300 or whatever it was. I'm just not as interested in that kind of stuff. I could do it, but it'd require a huge amount of effort and research for me. So I needed to keep mine sort of popular culture. So in some ways, it makes it easier because I can take a lot more liberties. So when I'm designing, I think about, well, what makes something fun? And how can I incorporate this theme really strongly? And so that's where I'm going. I'm not thinking about individual battles or the way that Romans moved on the battlefield. You could play video games for that kind of stuff. Mine was, higher level, of course, because it's a mega game. And I did have, you do have to balance the mechanics versus the role play versus how easy everything is. Yeah, it needs to be somewhat complex so that people are invested. And you just do that as you go. You have an idea for a role and you just sort of work within the boundaries of those kind of four things and just hope that you get it right. It's a struggle all the way to the end, really. And I made some serious change to the priest game because of that. Like right before I'm about to run the game, I originally had split the priests into two different types: people that talk to the gods and people that receive information from the gods. And right before the day hit, I'm like, you know what? Let's try that every priest does both of those things and just see how it goes. So you never know until the rubber meets the road, like what it's going to look like. You just hope you've done it right.
And speaking of, how long do you think? I mean, if we ignore the part where you change things, the night before, basically, how long did you find that design process took, including the testing and getting it to a point where you've got a document that you said, this is it, this is the game now?
I gave myself 12 months
Mm-hmm.
from initial sort of concept to running the game. I think a project plan is very important if you want to be successful. If you're sort of kind of wishy-washy, it might take several years and it might never happen. And so for me, that project plan was really important. And I designed it in such a way that when it was finished and ready to go, it was already a package. I know that I think it's a travesty that megagame designers, they put all this effort in and then they run it once or twice and then no one else ever gets to see it outside of that area. And so I wanted to create something that could be shared around the world. You know, thinking about my initial experience with Watch the Skies, it's so popular and so it's got the name recognition, and so you can kind of force through some of the stuff that you don't know. And so I designed mine from the beginning so that it was available to someone else to run, in quotes, out of the box once it was done, if you like.
Yeah, perfect. That's what that's sort of one of the goals I've got moving forward with designing games. I'm very much guilty of that former method where it's just you just frantically create things, run them, and then you're exhausted. And you in my case, I'm usually pretty cynical about how the game was designed, and I just throw it in the cupboard and never touch it again. So that's awesome. I think definitely more people should be focused on how to package things up from the start, because if you don't think about it early on, like you say, with a bit of a plan, it just becomes wild and unmanageable, and you've got little documents here and there and notes written down, and it's not clear versions of things. Yeah. Did you manage to do much playtesting of this game during the development?
Yeah, we did. Again, my group of friends that were along for the ride, who I'm always so grateful for, because they had no idea what megagame was until I was trying to pitch them Watch the Skies originally. Yeah, I had them over, and as long as you ply them with plenty of beer and whiskey, you know, I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, so that's bourbon. Then they're along. Yeah, they're happy to play anything I put in front of them, no matter how crappy it is. So, you know, and when you're playtesting, you break things down into smaller pieces. You know, you play the commander game so you've got a map and you're moving troops around. You're playing the overseer guildsman game where you're playing with the resources. And so we had, I don't know, maybe a dozen different playtests over the course of sort of that 12 months, I suppose. Yeah, you can't put it all together, of course, but yeah, it was. By the time and by the time we were ready to rock and roll, like I knew that it was in a really good place, and so yeah, I was very comfortable with the design once we got there.
Well, let's dive into some of the details of that design. Like, I'm very interested to hear about the roles, particularly like the priest role that you were talking about, where their job is to communicate with the gods and do that kind of thing. What kind of stuff? Yeah, what were they focused on? How did that role work?
Yeah. So there is a core gameplay loop that I started very early on. It was sort of my moment of inspiration where I was like, oh, this is going to work great. So this was a very early mechanic that I had in mind as I was designing. And so it begins with the mortals praying to the gods. And what that involves is every single player has a single token. And I called it a prayer token. And it is blue if you're on the Greek side, and it is red if you're on the Roman side. And what they do is everyone takes their token. If you're a priest, you get a few more because you've got a little bit more sway with the gods. But everybody takes their tokens and they deposit them in a piggy bank for the individual gods. So then what happens is after 5 minutes pass, those results are tallied, and they're tallied in two different ways. One, which god has the most prayers, and which god has the least prayers, and you can create a chart behind the scenes in Mount Olympus. You can create a chart of sort of a ranking of the gods, who got the most prayers and who got the least. And not only that, the gods get to see which faction is praying for them the hardest. So if you're Zeus and you've got like 10 blue tokens, but you've only got 2 red tokens, well, you're like, well, the Greeks really like me this time. Maybe I should go teach the Romans that they should be praying a little harder to me. So that's the prayer token mechanic. And then not only that, you've got the priests, and the priests can pray to the gods. The first time we ran it, we had a laptop set up with a one-way Discord to Mount Olympus, and the priests would stand there in front of this Discord laptop and speak the prayers of the people to the gods at Mount Olympus. And so you'd have all these gods sort of huddled around another laptop behind the scenes, and someone would be like, "Oh, great Zeus, mighty Zeus, I am from the region of Napoli, and we require help with smiting our enemies, the vicious Greeks, that kind of stuff." So they're all paying attention behind the scenes, but it's a one-way interaction at that point. Simultaneously, what's happened is the gods have spent 5 minutes drawing drawing signs. So I wanted to represent the way that gods give signs to the mortals in this historical world. And the way it was done was the priests would interpret the way that the birds were flying. If they're flying a certain direction, or if they're in a particular speed or location or whatever it was, they would interpret that as the will of the gods in a certain way. So we had sort of a Pictionary mechanic whereby the gods were not allowed to use letters or numbers, but each of them had a whiteboard, and they would draw pictures or for both the Greeks and the Romans. So they'd have 2 whiteboards, and they'd have to write things on both whiteboards. And so then once the priests have finished praying to the gods, then the gods turn around and deliver them a whiteboard per faction. And then the priests get to try and work out what the heck the gods are trying to describe to them using this sort of Pictionary mechanic. And that worked brilliantly, better than I'd hoped for. So that was really good.
With the first run of this game, was this all known to the players? Did they realize how this mechanic worked, or were they kind of piecing it together as they also engaged with it?
The priests absolutely knew, yeah.
Okay.
I did a rule book per role, excuse me. So the priests knew that there was 2 ways of communicating with the gods. They were either praying to someone behind the scenes, or they were receiving whiteboard Pictionary to work out what the gods were trying to say back to them.
Right.
So they knew, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was just thinking in my head that's such an interesting mechanic to try to figure out through the game, but it would be so difficult to keep, to sort of conceal it. Just thinking back to, the secret roles and that kind of thing. But no, it makes sense that they.
We'll come back around to that, because there is some secrety stuff happening, which we'll come back to in a minute. But so the rest of this gameplay loop is, once the gods have got their prayer tokens, then you divvy up power tokens to each of them based on their ranking. So the god that received the most prayers might get 9 power, the second god might get 8, and so on all the way down to the god that got the least number of prayers. And then they use that power to activate card abilities. So each god had a handful of 12 cards, and then they could spend that power to activate those miracles, and then control team would sort of have to run to the mortal realm, enact those miracles, and sort of report back, if you like. The control team could do that, or the god could do it themselves, knowing that they weren't allowed to talk to people. There's a reason why they might choose the control to do it versus themselves, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But anyway, once all that's happened, and your units have been zapped, or your ship was made faster or whatever, then it gives the mortals something to think about through the rest of the game, and then sort of encourages them the next turn to change their prayers and who they're praying to, because if they need something on the oceans, they're going to talk to Neptune, or if one of their units has been killed, maybe they're hoping it back from the underworld. So that sort of changes how they interact with the gods the next turn. So that's the core gameplay loop through the game.
Awesome. It sounds amazing. How many different gods did you have in the game? Was each god kind of their own single individual, or were they on a mini team? How were things on that side of the game?
Yeah. So the first time we ran it, we had 10. They were all playing the same kind of game. The second time, I reduced it to 8 because it was a lot for control team to manage. I actually had 10 gods, but there was 2 gods that were not playing the same kind of game, which were much more role play heavy. So I had Persephone and Hermes, and I had those as runners, if you like. because they interact with the mortals a lot more than the other gods may do. So their game was a much more roleplay heavy game. The rest of the gods, and the way that I'd originally intended all the gods to be, is that not only are they doing this stuff to mess with the mortals, they are using these prayer tokens for a tracker that tracks the number of prayer tokens they get across the entire game. So they have a standing 1 through 8 all the way through the game, and every prayer token they receive gets added to that total. So they are all competing against each other to get to be the highest ranking at the end of the game. Now, the mortals don't know this. So as far as they know, they are praying to the gods and the gods are messing with them. But the gods are kind of playing both sides. Like they want the Greeks to like them because then they'll get blue tokens, and they also want the Romans to like them, so they'll get red tokens, so they get the most power so they can do more stuff, and also so they can rise in their own ranking against their fellow gods. Because the myths and legends, they are terrible, terrible beings, always squabbling amongst themselves. And so I really wanted to encourage that sort of infighting, if you like, playing both sides of the mortals against themselves. Yeah, against each other.
Awesome. So they end up feeling very fickle to the mortals.
Oh, super fickle. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so with the other non-god roles, you've got the armies, the governors, the senators, split onto different sides, I suppose. I'm assuming there's multiple teams within each, but you've got the Greeks and the Romans. How did the non-god world function, I suppose, before we dive into those individual roles?
Yeah. So you've got 2 factions. You've got the Greeks and the Romans. Within each faction, you have 4 regions. And within each region, you have a maximum of 6 roles. If you don't have quite the maximum number of players, the overseas and guildsmen you can just run both of them. So this maximum player count for this game is 62. Not only you also have a Roman emperor and a general, and you have a Greek king or queen and a general for them as well. So there's 62 players in total. So it is a faction versus faction game, which I haven't seen before. But really, if you the way that the regions work is, yes, they're supposed to be reporting to their faction leader, but they also have things that seem quite selfish. And the way that mega games go with role playing and thinking outside of the box, they want to do things that are all kinds of crazy things. I guess we'll talk about some of the things that happen to give you an idea later on once we get into spoiler territory. But yeah, they just want to play selfishly, because there's one thing you can rely on when you're designing a mega game is that people are selfish, and they're going to hoard resources, and they want things for their region that's better than the next region next to them, even though they're supposedly on the same team. And I could use that as a designer.
That's going to be our little clip for you to advertise this episode. People are selfish,
and I love it. Yes,
it's very it's very true. Any opportunity, yeah. So how did the interplay go with those 2 factions?
Brilliantly, yeah. So I've run it twice now. I ran it last year locally this year. Gosh, once in March. Is it March? No, it wasn't. It was the middle of summer, and then once at Gen Con. And not all regions were playing for their faction, which is exactly what I wanted. In fact, I even had one that declared independence, and on the fly, I had to come up with their own prayer tokens, because they weren't using red prayer tokens anymore. They were using yellow prayer tokens because there was a third faction, and it was this independent nation. So it was brilliant. And when the gods start receiving these yellow tokens, they're like, "What are these?" It's like, "Oh, these are your people from Roma or wherever it was." But yeah, it worked really well.
Yeah, nice.
Having gotten all this together and done this playtesting and everything, what do you think? What was your biggest worry about the game before you ran it for the first time, or what you were most excited about before you ran it for the first time?
I suppose I was most excited that it was going to run. That sounds bizarre, but you just pour so much of yourself into a design, and I'm just really excited for people to play it and to sort of embrace the roles. When we talk about what a mega game is, one of my definitions is that mega games are more about the role rather than the character. Now, some people will play a role as a character, and I certainly had characters in this game because I had the gods that were named. But when you've got a role that doesn't have a character, it's like, what do you do with it? So I can give you objectives and things, but it gives people a lot more freedom because they're not confined by this thing in your brief that says your character is trying to do this and your character is trying to do this. So, in the second game we played, I had someone who was in charge. It was a commander that was in charge of moving troops around and ships and that kind of stuff. And they were like, I would love to have pirates. Like, oh, that sounds like a fabulous idea. How had I not even thought about this? So that was before I even got there. And so when I was packing for it, I had some extra ships that were black. I was like, I'm just going to bring these along with me. And I got there and I said to her, I was like, if you would like, you tell me where you want these black ships to move, and I will move them for you or have the map control do it for you, so that nobody knows who these belong to, not even your own faction. Because if they see you moving them around, they're going to know that, oh, why is she moving these black ships around? And why is she attacking the Romans? And so it was a fabulous idea, and I think it was implemented really well. And so when you give people the freedom to do those kind of things with a role rather than a character, I think it drives some creativity, especially from mega gamers. Like, your first timers, they're not going to think of that kind of stuff. But the people that have done 2 or 3 games, like, here's an opportunity for something really cool.
And between running the game, did like you're saying, the briefs that people had based on their roles and their factions, they had certain agendas, that kind of thing. Did you do much major rewriting of the sort of objectives with the gods, the different factions, what they were trying to achieve, or is it sort of flexible enough as it sits, just to rerun again?
Yeah, I did not do a huge amount. In fact, I almost ran the first game without any sort of region-specific briefing. I guess I was thinking, like, you give someone a blank page, what are they going to do with it? I actually ran my design through a number of mega game designers in the community, and that was one of the criticisms I received. Like, actually, you probably should give them something, even because they don't have to follow that, of course.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, that's probably reasonable. So I did write some for them, certainly. Also, I wrote a bunch for the gods because there's so many myths and legends about the gods and how terrible they were and the kind of shenanigans they got up to. And so it made sense, as they were characters that already have backstories, to give them some cool things to do. So they all had a bunch of stuff to do. So yeah, that was my feedback, and I took it and ran with it. And then for the second run, I simply looked at the first run and stole a bunch of ideas that the players came up with on their own, and then included those in the documentation. So I can't take credit for some of them. So
Yeah, no, fair. And before we progress on too much, did you want to quickly give an overview of those other Greek and Roman roles? You talked about the senator and the armies, the generals. I don't want to chew up too much time, but did you want to give a bit of a rundown on each of those?
yeah, absolutely. So there are 6 roles per region. There is a governor. The governor is like a head of state in Watch the Skies, where it's a lot of communicating between the team, making sure everybody's got what they need, trying to find out what the heck's going on. They get to talk to the king and queen, or the emperor, and so that they have those lines of communication. They also have to deal with upkeep of regions that they conquer. So we'll talk about this in a moment, but when you conquer a new region, there is a loyalty mechanic for each region, and if you don't hit a certain threshold, then you get rebels in those regions, but you can pay to give them cool stuff to increase that loyalty. What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, there's the aqueducts, of course. So you can pay for aqueducts for them, or or whatever else, and that will increase their loyalty. And then they'll start. If you increase it enough, it will start generating stuff for you. So that gives the governors something to manage. So that's the governors. It's quite a role play heavy role, I would say, one for people that are familiar with mega games. You have commanders, and they are the folks that are moving troops around the map. It is a simple area control type game where you roll buckets of dice. I stole a mechanic from Fury of Dracula. I don't know if you guys know that one, where when you get into combat with Dracula, you have like some rock paper scissors kind of cards, and you play them, and you wait to see what they're going to play, and that affects sort of who wins. And so you can roll dice to see who gets the most hits on the dice, but then these sort of rock paper scissors mechanic sort of adds to that and changes the die results somewhat. So it sort of plays pretty quick, but I wanted to give people that had weaker armies a reasonable chance to still win, if that makes sense. And you do that with these rock paper scissors cards that you play, the action cards. And so the way they're themed is you play them as tactic cards. That's what they're called. So it might be a flank card, and a flank beats a charge, or a charge beats the defensive card, or those kind of things. So that's the way the command game works. The overseer and guildsman, they are the folks that run the economy for a region. So I took a leaf out of Den of Wolves book, where you've got food and water and that kind of stuff. So I probably went a bit more in detail than Den of Wolves, because it's just a single person managing it. But essentially, you're creating basic resources like wood, stone, iron, that kind of stuff. You have a number of buildings which you can spend those resources to buy. You can upgrade those buildings. Those buildings in turn create more resources. Some buildings create artisanal goods. Artisanal goods can be put onto ships and moved around the map. When they are moved far enough distance, they receive gold for your faction, which is sort of like a victory points, I suppose, in a lot of ways. The resources can also create soldiers, and your soldiers, as we talked about, take territory, and territory also generates gold. So there's like two ways to get gold for your faction: through shipping artisanal goods or conquering territory. And that's what the overseers and the guildsmen do. They sort of manage that economy.
In the conflict between these two factions and with gold, was that a situation where one faction was crowned the winner at the end of the game, or was it more non-binary? How did that bit work in that conflict between the Greeks and Romans?
It's absolutely a winner. I've heard through just being in the mega game world for a few years now, and just listening to podcasts and articles and things, that there shouldn't be like a victory point system because it's meaningless or whatever. But I felt like in a faction versus faction game, what's the harm? And so when you've got regions that are creating gold, and if all your regions are working in sync with each other, you should generate a bunch of gold. And at the end of the game, you can see which region has the most gold, and whoever has the most is the, in quotes, winner. And I'm very clear when I say this that for many people, they don't care, and that's okay. But for some people, they do. Like, you've got people that are board gamers that are not super extroverted, and the overseer and guildsman is the perfect role for them. And they want a goal, right? Creating soldiers, they never get to see the soldiers. Creating artisanal goods, well, they never get to see those, sort of do anything with those. And so for them, if they could get their economy really strong, by the end of the game, they can feel great that they contributed a whole bunch to their side winning, in quotes, winning. So I quite like that. And that's another change that I made based on other designers giving me feedback. Originally, it was just victory points, and I was encouraged to turn it into something tangible like gold. And though I had not written rules around the gold necessarily at that time, I like the gold because it's a new currency that encourages out of the box play. So when someone comes to me and says, "I would like to take over this region, but I don't want to fight," I'm like, okay, that sounds like you could definitely bribe them with some gold. So you're spending your victory points to move your thematic game forwards, if that makes sense.
And it does sound like
Yeah.
quite a good game setting for that adversarial.
Yeah.
Someone wins, someone doesn't. I also really like the way that you've explained the overseer, the guildsman, how board gaming it is, because as you were explaining all of this with the resources, that kind of thing, it did feel like there was a large chunk of the game that sounded very mechanical, more mechanical than I'd expected from this. And that's been a real. I think that's a real challenge for a lot of people to be able to create that role that satisfies that certain type of player without it being totally just disconnected from the rest of the game, but also without pushing them into stuff that they may not be interested in, like the governor role. Did you
Right.
struggle to connect the dots there and make them feel part of the team?
No, not really. There's an argument you said about Den of Wolves that everybody on a given ship manages those resources.
Mm.
I know the rules kind of say, well, it's this one person, it's the chief engineer or whatever it was, but that's not really true. Like everybody kind of does it in reality. So I didn't see any harm in having someone specific that does that specific role for a region, particularly because like we just talked about, there are some people that play mega games for the social interaction and they want to think outside the box and they want to do the role play. And there are some people that are just not comfortable with that. And you have to have something specific for them to really own. And they can feel good about contributing to their region through this sort of, in quotes, heavy mechanical game that they're playing.
Yeah, definitely.
So with gold being this victory point currency, how did you find that translating on the day? And so is gold a more hidden victory point thing, or is it something where you can know, oh, they're this much above us in gold, we need to step up our game?
That's a great question, and it's one honestly that I've not thought about considerably. There's a mega game. There's so many moving pieces, so trying to track that mid game is probably nigh impossible.
Yeah.
But honestly, when I'm wrapping up a game, I've done this twice now. I've forgotten about gold both times because there's so many stories that happen, and then I've had to have one of the players be like, "What about the gold? Which faction won?" I'm like, "Oh shoot, I'm sorry. Yeah, some people care about this," uh, and so it is not. Whilst it is hidden, like most of the time, the governors kept the gold in their pockets.
Mm.
And so you don't know until the game's over when people are emptying pockets of gold all over the table, and I'm like, just count it up and tell me the numbers,
Yeah.
So it's hidden faction, region versus region. Also, talking about people being selfish, I don't necessarily want all that to be visible because I want people to be,
Mm.
slightly selfish with each other and not know what's happening behind the scenes. Like that's the beauty of a mega game for me. It's miscommunication. It's not just communication. It's miscommunication and misinformation. And so for me, I'm very comfortable not knowing how people are using gold and how they're hoarding it and how that. I mean, there's really only two main ways of getting it, and that's through artisanal goods selling and the conquering territories. So it's not a huge surprise when one team wins necessarily. But you can almost guarantee after the first time we ran it, like the first thing people wanted to do with gold in that first game was trade it for different goods. They're like, we want to create a marketplace where we can spend gold to get goods. Like they didn't care about gold either, really. And so they wanted to turn it into different types of goods. And so I wrote sort of hidden mechanics for that I never revealed. But I knew for a fact they were going to appear in game 2. And so when that happened, we had a new building that was a trading post. And they were able to spend their gold in a balanced way because we just kind of had to make it up on the fly the first game. But the second game, we actually had mechanics for it and people used it. So
Awesome. I've definitely had that same experience with victory points. I feel like it's funny, even when you do have like a quote unquote winner in a mega game, very few people necessarily care about that. It's really
Mm.
much
Yeah.
more about like
Yeah.
their own personal things that they want to do, and like victory points, they'll be like, well, what's the point of these? And you'll be like, oh, well,
Right.
that's what, kind of wins the game. And they're like, oh, well, who cares?
Mm.
Well, some of my feedback from that first game was and this is totally valid feedback. The overseers, at least two people said, "What's the point of the last turn of the overseer game when you've got this engine that you're building that produces stuff, but you can't do anything with it in the last turn?" I was like, "Oh, what a great point!" And they gave me the feedback and the suggestion, which was to have some sort of conversion, like 3 pieces of wood is 1 piece of gold, and 2 pieces of stone is 1 piece of. Oh, it's like so obvious. Like I've seen that in a 1,000 victory point games, board games, and so people did care about it, and so that's what we did. We said if you've got 3 pieces of wood, that's worth the equivalent of 1 piece of gold, and so people were paying attention to how much gold their faction had at the end of the game.
Yeah. And it is funny on caring about it. It's even when you have these games where it's very deliberately been designed so that there aren't victory points and there's no winners or losers, but everyone has their own little goals that they're trying to achieve, sort of roleplay wise. Even then, people often don't care whether they achieved them or not. They're just
Yeah.
they're excited about their experience and the story they had and the stuff that they got to witness, and that's kind of the recurring verdict on mega games, I think, regardless of what
think
the
so.
end game's meant to look like.
Very true. Yeah, I think it's a lot like Twilight Imperium, the board game, is a lot like this, where there are victory conditions, but what you often see happen is people just being like, I don't care, I'm just gonna make a cool spaceship and blow people up and do whatever. Like that's definitely
Yeah.
what mega games often feel like to me.
So bouncing back to the roles, were there any others that we needed to cover before we delve into how the actual day went when you first ran this, Tony?
Yeah, there's one more, and that is the lawmaker or the senator.
Yes.
So some people hate the Senate game in a mega game. I think it's great, but it has to be done right, and it has to have a connection with the rest of the game. So I took some inspiration from the King's Dilemma, the board game, and had a sort of slimmed down version of a turn for that. So I wanted each senator to have a number of tokens representing political sway, and each turn a number of laws gets placed in front of them, and they can vote yay or nay on each of those laws and spread their political power across those however they see fit. So if there's something they really want, they can just stack it all on one, and if they're not super bothered about it, they sort of spread it as they want to. This is all done behind screens, so I created some little screens for the game so you couldn't see it, and then they're all revealed simultaneously. You count to see all the yays and nays, and you see which ones get passed forwards. When a law gets passed, this is a la Cosmic Encounter, whereby it breaks the rest of the game in a very specific way. And so it changes the rule for somebody else's game in a small way, usually. So it might be that... I need some good examples off the top of my head now. I'm going to struggle. It might be that... they pass a law that says this senator is corrupt and we want to let the people know, therefore they get less political power. Or it might be that regions can now be conquered via bribes. Or it might be that fisheries are being funded by the government and they produce more. But we, as control, what we have to do is balance the negatives to each of those things. Like, you can't just pass a law that says all your fisheries produce double. Like, that's just not a real law. And so that funding has to come from somewhere. And so we say, okay, that law looks fine, but it means that you have to spend 1 gold each turn, and each fishery produces 2 extra food. And so, which sort of simulates sort of reality. If you're funding something, you get something back from it. And there's always a positive and negative to each one. And we had like 50 laws that were already pre-written, and then a bunch of blank law cards, so they could produce whatever they could create whatever law they wanted to, and then the control member that was working with those would help balance that. And I actually ended up in the second run making sure there was 2 control members. Originally, I had one that sort of controlled 2 factions, because there's 2 senates going at the same time. You've got a Roman senate and a in quote a Greek senate. So you've got 2 sets of laws being created every time, and then you need a control runner to make sure that those things get implemented correctly. So that's the way that game goes.
It sounds like a very neat little approach to a council game. Very keen to hear how that actually went. Before we jump into what we'll call the spoiler section, where you're free to talk about any of the details of what happened behind the scenes, that kind of thing. One thing I did want to ask was your experience running this game or other games at cons. You mentioned that earlier, and we had a brief chat about it before we started recording. It's something that's pretty. It doesn't really happen here, and it's something that we're exploring how to make it happen. But it seems very, very popular, and for some people, it's almost exclusively how they experience mega games in the States. How's your experience been with con games and versus designated days where it's just a mega game event happening?
Yeah, so I run both locally and at Gen Con. I have not run at any other cons yet, although I have plans to this next year. And you're correct in thinking that most people only experience mega games through conventions. There are some others that get run around the country. There's Shucks up in Canada, and there's PAX. I know that they're trying to run some games in PAX. It's very different when everything is local and I'm not running in a convention. That's probably my preference, because I'm a little bit of a control freak, and I think any game organizer has to be a bit of a control freak and a little OCD. Otherwise, it's not going to happen, right? And when it's something local like that, everything is within your control. So, I do all the advertising, and I make sure that I've got a room, and I make sure that the room has AV equipment. And if it doesn't, then I need to provide that. And I have to have a website so I can advertise the game. And I need to make sure that I've got some tickets. So I need to work with a ticket system to make sure that happens. And so all these things go into creating an event that is 100% within my control. And there are positives and negatives of that. The negatives are, it's bloody hard work, right? But the positives are, it's 100% me, and I can fashion that the way I want it to be. I work with the Megagame Coalition. I'm part of their little council, and we are made up of people that run mega games around the country, North America, so including Canada. And we work as a team to put on events at conventions. They have been doing it a lot longer than I have, so in some ways I have to sort of step back and let them do things in a certain way. But also sort of got enough... I've been around the block a few times now, and so I can sort of step in and say, actually, probably we need to do it this way. But when you're working with a convention, especially Gen Con, because it's such a big thing, you have to do events in a very specific way, and they give you the space, and they do the advertising for you. And in fact, at Gen Con, you can almost guarantee that your game's going to sell out. So I don't have to worry about any of that stuff, which is amazing. But you're working with a whole group of people, and I am just one part of that team, and therefore I don't always get my way. They're all amazing people, don't get me wrong, but they are different people, and so we all have different ideas on the way things need to work, and what makes a fair system for everybody, and how do we thank our volunteers and that kind of stuff. That is all much more democratic. So that is, again, has its positives and negatives. Very different.
And clearly,
Mm.
it's got the benefits are there and large enough for you to be interested in continuing doing it. So that's always good to hear. I imagine it's
Absolutely.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
huge way to get new faces and people engaged with the hobby.
Yeah. The only thing is that the folks that play at Gen Con, it's sort of an opposite of what we talked about earlier, whereby if I ask who's not played a mega game before, I get it's probably a 75-25 split. People that have played mega games before is the majority, because they're there for a specific reason, and in order to get in those events, they are there at noon on that Sunday when the events are released, like tapping that button, ready to catch those tickets before they all sell out. So they're the folks that really want to play mega games, and you've got to bring your A game because
Mm.
they've played Watch the Skies and Den of Wolves. In fact, they probably have played Den of Wolves like 10 times each because they played it through the pandemic online and those kind of things. So they are desperate for new games and new designs because they've played the originals so many times. Whereas I could take Den of Wolves, take it to a city that's like a neighbor city here in Louisville. So like I'm going to run in Ohio this year in Columbus. I don't think a Den of Wolves or Mega Game's ever been running Columbus before. So I'm probably going to get, 80% new players at that one. But
Mm.
Gen Con is very different. People want something brand new, and they because they're sick of the ones that have been done before. Maybe
Right.
not sick. Maybe that's not the right word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, exhausted maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
And with that, building on that, I'm curious if you think what it seems like the con scene is a big part of it, but what would you say kind of separates megagaming in America from megagaming in other places? Like, is there a particular, I don't know, megagaming culture that you would say is like distinctly American or an American style? I'm just very interested in that because I think there is quite a lot of differences between Australia and England and other places. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about the similar thing for America.
Oh, it's really hard. It's a really hard question. I don't have a good answer for you. I have played earlier this year. I happened to be in England at the right time, and I managed to play in First Contact in
Mm.
March. No, March, excuse me, May. It was in London with very large, huge games. Fantastic experience. Um, I don't know if it was much different than something over here. In some ways, I've said this before in other mediums that Brits have a more farcical sense of humor, I suppose, and so they are probably much more comfortable with like the other game that they do is like the apocalypse. I forget what it's called now. The apocalypse one, and they're like, let's all have tea and crumpets in the apocalypse. Like, it's bonkers, right? And that probably works great in the UK, where we're brought up on Monty Python and and Dame Edna Everage and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But in the US, you have some really big characters, like Americans are kind of loud and proud, and so they want to really get into things. Like I played Deep, I helped control Deep Haven at Gen Con this year, and boy, did they get into being dwarves. Like they were all cheering and beating their chests and all kinds of stuff to really get into character. And I think the Brits are just a bit more reserved.
Yeah.
And so it was
Oh.
quite interesting. Now again, it has positives and negatives. Like what came from that really heavy role play, verging on a LARP basically in Gen Con, was a little bit of tribalism, whereby people were really into their tribe, and it was a little off-putting for some people. So I don't think you're going to get that in quite as strong as way in the UK. I have no idea what the Australian mega game scene is like. I'd be really curious to hear your opinion, but yeah, there's probably some differences, but overall, we're just all gamers at the end of the day.
It sounds like we've asked a few people this question, and I think it always boils down to like just the actual cultural differences that you've pointed out.
Mhm.
But yeah, I would maybe a bit cheekily, but I would say yes. There's loud and proud American style. There's more reserved UK, and then I think Australia is a bit sort of indifferent. So they're even quieter. Not super worried about anything. Laid back.
I see.
We get a pretty diverse crowd, I think, at the Sydney games. But yeah, we I don't know. No one takes it so seriously as to draw any concerns or any discomfort that I've ever witnessed. Like you're saying with the tribalism forming and that kind of thing. But yeah, I imagine that ours is probably very similar to the UK as we are in many ways, and probably just a little bit more laid back. But yeah, we're also still developing. We're still figuring it all out because we've
Very
been running
true.
games
Very true.
for years, but we are much smaller scale just because of the size of everything here,
Yep.
the distances, the people, that kind of thing.
Yep.
But yeah, it's very interesting I always want to ask people because, especially those who have encountered it in different places, because I'm very interested to see how the community is developing ever since that video and it's shot out all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably delve into running this game, how it went for you, that kind of thing. So I'll put a little disclaimer here to say that we might delve into some spoilers. Obviously, if there's anything you want to keep very close to your chest, you're welcome to. But did you want to just kick us off by saying how the game ran? You've run it several times now. How did it go on that very first instance? And what going into it, what were you worried about, but also what surprised you that you didn't really expect? And also, let's go into some of those sort of background mechanics and little side schemes that you've got going.
Yeah. So I don't tell the mortals when they first start playing that kind of what the gods are doing behind the scenes. So in some ways, I've already got a little spoiler out there. I mentioned earlier the way that the gods are sort of competing against each other. I don't think that's a super spoiler, but here is the spoiler for that part of the game: is that the gods have a mechanic whereby they can disguise themselves as a mortal and go to the mortal realm. This is something I wanted early on after sort of doing my research on the kind of shenanigans that the gods got up to, and I put a lot of thought into like how to pull this off. And every time I describe it to someone, I get this sort of like really skeptical, like, "Oh, this is never going to work," And it's like, I'm going to make it work. I'm going to do it, dang it. And so what we did is when I had I give them different books to start off with. I give them a main rule book each, but then I give the gods a special rule book that tells them what their game's going to look like. And then when they turn up for the event, I have the gods go through a different door. I don't have them check in like everybody else. I'm like, go through this door quick before anybody sees you, sort of thing. And so they all disappear into this back room because I want to give them as many tools as I can for them to remain anonymous. And so if they ever want to go down to the mortal realm, they can. They can go down loud and proud. I had a guy as Neptune who had this great big white beard and this massive robe and a big trident, and he just sort of stomped around in the mortal realm, and people would like throw themselves in front of him and worship him, but they're not allowed to communicate outside of that. But then there is this mechanic where they can sort of go down, and as the control team will help them remain anonymous. So I have a bunch of blank name tags, or name tags for regions that are not like in quotes in the game. And so I can say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take your name tag off, and I'm going to give you one that says, you're now the governor of Dalmatia. The Dalmatia that's an NPC region, but can be conquered. And so if it gets conquered by the Greeks, for example, and then one of the gods is like, I'd love to go down there and just sort of snoop around. Like, okay, great. You're now the governor of Dalmatia. Here's a name tag. I'm going to introduce you to the rest of the Greeks as a new player. Like, oh, you turned up halfway through the game or whatever. You really wanted to play, so we've given you a bonus role. And so they go down there and they role play that way. And if they're ever found out, they have to go back to Mount Olympus. But it worked so well in the second game that all game, I was talking to one of the governors of one of the Greek kingdoms, and he kept saying to me like, will you pass a note to the Egyptian governor for me, please? I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. So he writes this note down for his Egyptian governor and hands it to me, and then I'm like, who the hell do I give this to? Like, I have no idea. So I walked over to Mount Olympus and was like, okay, guys, who is masquerading as an Egyptian governor? And this guy, one of the gods, is like, yeah, that's me. I'm like, oh, brilliant. Well, this is what they would like to do with you. And then I hand him the note. And I do this several times through the game. And it was like one of my favorite moments is at the end of the game. I'm like, when we're doing this sort of big reveal, I'm like, by the way, the Egyptian governor was actually Hades or whatever it was. And he's like, what? It was brilliant. It worked so well. So that was a big spoiler and one of the things that they could do. Yeah.
And so how in future games and as you sell this mega game to other people to run, do you encourage them to stick to that?
Oh, that's a good question. I think people can still get away with it. Like, it's not a massive part of the game for a start. Like, if it was a big component of the game, maybe it would make a big difference. It doesn't. It's just something fun to do. I have some mini objectives written for the gods to do it and to do, when they're down there to do certain things. But it's not a massive thing. I'll tell you about the first game. The first game, there was very few people doing that. They did it a little bit, but we found that the gods that got the most prayers were the ones that were the loudest when they went to the mortal realm. So they all dressed up, role played. They were down there stomping around, like looking over people's shoulders, and people, sort of do double take that Hades is looking over their shoulder and a hand of death on them. And so we found that they got the most prayers, and it was very detrimental to the more reserved players in the god realm. So that was one of my biggest changes between the games, is that I added a new resource basically for the gods. I split power, which I talked about earlier. That's the thing that powers miracles. I split power into two things. It was I split into, I forget the name of it now, but it was like positive power and spite, which was the negative power. And the miracles, I had to rebalance all the miracles so that some of them used positive power and some of them used spite. And some of them used a combination of both. But like, if you're Zeus and you lightning bolt a troop and you kill them, that is powered via spite. But if you're Zeus and you make rains to make the lands more fertile and the farms create more food, that is something that uses positive power. So everybody had lots of things to do. All the gods had lots of things to do in the second game, no matter where they fell on the ranking. I think that worked out really nicely.
How did the rest of the game go outside that? You said that the the little twist about the gods and the role that they could play in the game was a bit of a surprise. Was there anything else from the player perspective that people came and said to you afterwards they didn't expect it out of this game, or was there anything conversely? And I feel like this is a stupid question because it's a mega game, but what did the players manage to pull off that you weren't expecting?
Oh boy, yeah. We talked about the pirate thing earlier. That was really cool. She had a lot of fun with that. Her whole team did. The independence thing was really cool as well. In the second game, and I mentioned this earlier, that the mega gamers at Gen Con are much more mega gamers, whereas you're not going to get quite as many outside the box things happening in a local event. So we had the Spartan Hole was created, so people could kick people down into the hole, of course. So we had to come up with rules for that. I don't know why I didn't foresee that one coming. But then I asked the control team, I was like, how did they come up with this hole? Like, did they just dig it? And they're like, oh no, they got the help of a god. I'm like, oh great.
Of course.
Oh, what's it connected to? And they're like, I don't know. It's like, oh, let's go talk to Hades and see if we can say like, oh, by the way, your hole's connected straight to Hades. And then we could have things crawling out of it, That was just a fabulous storyline. It was so funny. The other really big thread that happened was it was a younger guy. He's probably like late teens, something like that. And you always know that all the late teens, people in their late teens, early 20s, they've got all these zany ideas and not quite as stubborn and as old as us 30s and 40-year-olds. And you can always guarantee they're going to come up with the weirdest ideas, and you sort of have to put a leash on them sometimes. But anyway, this guy approached me. He's like, I want to kill a god. I'm like, oh, dang. Okay. Give me some time. So I went away and thought about it, and I went back to him a little bit later and said, okay, you're going to need Hephaestus to help you craft the thing. You're going to need a demigod to wield the weapon, and you're going to need a piece of a mythical beast. It's like, okay, how do I do that? I was like, look, man, this is you got to go find these things out for yourself. And I swear, half the game later, he's like, I'm a demigod, I've got this weapon, and Hephaestus, it's made out of a piece of a dragon, and Hephaestus crafted it for me. Like, dang, like he really worked all game for this. And it was just like halfway through, I was like, what am I going to do if a god dies? I really didn't think, I thought it'd be like a late game thing. Anyway, so through the course of this, I was like, I wanted to make sure that he really had done all these things. And so I was like, where'd you get the piece of the dragon from? And he's like, oh yeah, it's from one of the other Greeks. One of the Greeks slayed this dragon. It came out of the hole. Like, okay. And so I went to the other guys. It's like, so you've got this dragon carcass, right? They're like, yeah. I said, did you give any of it to this guy over here? And they're like, no. I was like, oh, so he thinks he's got a piece of a dragon, but he doesn't really. It's like, oh, that's great. I can now say that this dragon doesn't work because it's not forged properly. And so I told Hephaestus that he was given like a piece of whale bone instead of dragon bone or whatever it was. And Hephaestus is like, okay, that sounds cool, It's like, I don't care if it doesn't work, And so this guy, he sets up this plot where they're praying to Zeus to have him visit their region. And eventually Zeus comes along, and there's this massive reveal where he's like, and I slay Zeus with this mighty hammer, and he sort of hits Zeus with it. I'm like, and then so as a control team, I just say, it just bounces off him. And this guy's face just drops. And he comes to me afterwards, he's like, what happened? And I said, you didn't actually use any dragon parts, did you? He's like, yeah, I did. It's like, I don't think you did. You need to go talk to your team. And so he spent the rest of the game trying to do the same thing. Like, it was just this amazing, amazing game. Later on, he sort of changed his tune. He ended up being killed, going to Hades and finding his way back. And he's like, hey, does that mean I'm a zombie now? I'm like, sure, why not? Let's have zombies too. He just had like the best time, this guy. And it, when I say to people when they come to me with these ideas, and I say this at the very beginning of the game, any event that I run, I'm like, this game is not all about you, the individual. This is a social game with another 50 plus people playing. So if you come up with an idea, make sure that you're bringing lots of people along with you to have fun too. Like, think about this game and how you can make at least 2 people have as much fun as you are having. And so people really take that to heart. And so he had like a whole team of people working with him for this. Hades just did a fantastic job with killing people and bringing them back. I had Persephone, who was supposed to be like Hades' right-hand man, who totally betrayed him at the end of the game. She just let out all the heroes from the underworld, and he had no idea. And so, and she worked with a bunch of people to do it, and they all ended up, all these heroes that she released ended up at this region. There was the region that sort of left their faction, and so they had all these heroes, and they felt like they were pretty powerful. And this is all like end game stuff, and as long as everyone has this idea that they're there to make sure everybody else has fun, like everybody has the best time possible. And so I really try and enforce that with my teach and the way that I run games.
It sounds like the classic journey of the designer going through all those stories where you're just like, this was never on the table. I didn't expect for this to happen. There's not meant to be zombies. But it sounds like everyone really bought into the setting and the story, and it sounds like some very cool ideas that came out of the emergent gameplay.
I've shown I had some little video taken. One of my friends took a
Mm.
bunch of video, and we turned it into like a little promo piece. And I've shown this promo piece to lots of people, mostly non-gamers and non-mega gamers, and they're all shocked at how into it people are. You know, I've got people in togas and you know, wreaths and dressed up as Poseidon and that kind of stuff, and they're like, they kind of think it's funny. I'm like, no, these, you don't understand. People are so into it,
Yeah.
like that they put their whole selves into it, and I think it's really endearing. And as a designer, it just, you know, it just gives me all the warm and fuzzies that people are so into the game and the theme that they go all out. Basically, Roman Centurion in full armor was just amazing. I don't know how that guy survived the
Yeah.
6 hours, but you know, just great experience.
Yeah, for sure. It's always impressive the costuming and props people come up with. We've
Yeah.
had a couple here, and unfortunately, most of the games I've run just happened to be in summer until recently when we ran multiple throughout the year, and we'd have
Mhm.
people come with heavy robes and chainmail and all kinds of
Mhm.
stuff, and
That's right.
the commitment there is just like I'm here for this. I'm not taking this off. I
No.
love it. I love it. Mechanically, when you ran this, did you find between the first run and future runs, or you know, publishing it as a package that people can buy, did you need to tweak and fix anything up? Was there anything that fell apart in the background, mechanics wise, or was it all pretty as expected?
Yeah, so as I said, between the first and second games, we changed a bunch, particularly with the way the gods worked. And we had all those sort of behind the scenes things in our back pocket ready to go. But
Mm.
after the second run, I changed almost nothing. It just ran so well, and as a designer, there comes a point where you have to say this is done, right? I could have probably written a lot more bits and pieces and tweaked words here and phrasing, and I changed some certainly for clarification purposes, but you can't. And I've heard this on your podcast before. You can't please everybody. There will always be some criticisms. Mega games are not for everybody. You cannot take everything to heart that people say. But if the overwhelming opinion is that it's a great game, then I think you're really onto something. And the rules are a tool to get to that point, right? And if your rules are mostly solid and you've got a strong control team, and you know, like I said, after that second game, I looked at the rules and looked at the feedback, and I didn't feel the need to change anything significant. It worked so well.
Awesome.
And by that point, it was mostly packaged. As I said, you know, I built it that way, and I was able to get it up on my website for sale within like 2 weeks after I'd finished running it, because it was ready to go.
So how have you found having it up for sale? Has anyone tried it out yet?
Yeah, I have sold one copy.
Mhm.
I'm
Nice.
going to consider that a win, seeing as
Oh,
though it's only
definitely.
been on sale for like 2 or 3 months now, and I haven't done a huge amount of advertising. I know these are the Dallas guys I've mentioned earlier, but I know that they're planning on running it sometime next year. They were super excited to hear about the theme. And I don't know. I would like to hope that other people would be interested in running it. I really want other people to run it, because I've packaged it in a way that it should be easy to run out of the box. I feel like that's the biggest challenge, as I've mentioned before. I listen to a podcast like yours or the Mega Game Assembly one, and I hear these amazing games that they talk about, and then they're either not for sale or it's not ready for sale. I'm like, oh, come on, it's just like teasing me or something. So, even if nobody else buys it, it's there and it's available, and I hope people can be excited about the theme and know that it's a solid game. I have got so much documentation on my website about. You could read all about my design process. I did a whole blog series with probably about a dozen different entries where I talked about how I designed each element. And then you can see the promo video, and I've got some marketing pages where you can get some an idea of the production costs and what it's going to take and what the materials look like. So, and a big control guide as well. Not just a control guide, but also an organizer guide about what it takes to set up a game and some of the pitfalls that we fell into and some of the ways you can avoid those. And of course, I've got like a bunch of personal information on there too, so I'm easily available to reach out to and ask clarifying questions. So I've given the world a package with all the tools, and it is available if anybody would like to run it.
Yeah.
So, what would be your best advice for people who do want to run the game? What would be your big thing that they should keep in mind, or the top thing that would be helpful?
Are you talking about an experienced mega game runner or someone that's never run one before?
Let's say they're a first timer.
Oh boy. As a first timer, read as much as you can of everything. Listen to podcasts, read blog posts. There is nothing, it's hard to describe to someone that's never run a game before what it takes to put on an event, especially a local thing like most of us do. Gen Con is a different beast, and we are going through right now with the Mega Game Coalition. Right now, we're making a real conscious effort for next year to get new game runners to put on games, and we're going to give them as many tools as we can and as much support as we can to make lots of people successful. And you can be successful in that environment because so much of the work is done for you. You don't have to find a venue, and your marketing is going to be non-existent, and you'll probably sell out and blah blah blah. But you still have to do the components, and you still have to know how to run an event, and you still have to be active in the community and all these things. So if you want to run something at Gen Con, get in contact with us and we'll help you. If you want to run something locally, we've got a mentor program. So talk to someone that has run before, and I can hook you up with people if you need someone to hold your hand and walk you through this process, because it is hard. But just read all the documentation, read Becky blogs, and read the Mega Game Assembly blogs, and listen to all these podcasts, and do everything you can to just know what you're letting yourself in for to be successful.
For sure.
To your other questions, like to someone that's run before, what advice would I give them? Read the document, buy the package, read it start to finish, and then see what you need. Like, if you've run one or two games before, you kind of know how to run them at that point anyway. So I would like to think this is a nice package, but I don't know because no one else has run it yet. But I am looking for feedback from those people to say, I didn't know this, I had to ask you for it. And then I'll be like, great, I'm going to add that to the documentation. That's going to be my version 1.1. And then I'll re-upload it again because I didn't think about that the first time around.
Yeah, it's been a regular through line with conversations lately on and off the podcast about this packaging up games, how to present them in a way that makes them easy to run, and also that whole transfer of knowledge, teaching people what they need to know to run an event like this. So we'll definitely be including some links to your website and the game itself, the video. I was just scrolling through the page on your website now, and I did see in one of the screen caps of the map, the infamous hole. There's just this scrap of paper thrown onto the map that says hole.
It says the word hole. I know, it's ridiculous.
I love it's so mega game, and like if you hadn't have told me before I looked at that, I would have thought, geez, there's a story there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's amazing. Did you also see on that same picture, there are some 3D prints that people brought specifically? We were talking about players getting engaged and
Yeah.
wanting to be part of the game. Like, they 3D printed statues and cities and brought them to include them in the game that they were playing.
Yeah.
They didn't just dress up; they brought their own components, which I just think is amazing.
It's amazing, yeah. And the production value in this game, it looks beautiful, but also it's classic mega game with the little tokens and that kind of thing. But it just looks very a step up. It looks very neat, well designed, very consistent. I love it.
Well, thank you.
So we are short on time at this point, but I suppose before we start to close out, Tony, what you did allude to this before we started recording, but what have you got planned in the future for Gods of the Ancient World, but also other games and other events? What's next year look like for the Dukes of Highland?
Busy.
Good.
I have. I ran 4 games this year. I ran Den of Wolves twice, and I ran Gods twice. Next year, I would like to run perhaps 9 games.
Ooh.
Wow.
So, because I'm so frustrated that there are not more gaming groups, I'm trying to branch out a little bit to go to some of my neighbor cities, as I mentioned before. So I have, and when you go to a new place, a new location, especially one that's far away, like you can't just visit. It's not easy to just visit and know the people you're talking to and that kind of stuff. So I sort of have to have boots on the ground for those locations. So like I have a group of folks that come down from Michigan, and I said, you drive 6 hours every time, and I really appreciate it, but if you help me, I can bring it closer to you. Michigan's, it's not too bad of a drive. 6 hours is nothing for US standards. And that's about as far as I'm willing to go. I'm not willing to drive any further than that. I'm old now. And so we are going to run Den of Wolves in Ann Arbor, Michigan in March. And Den of Wolves is such a great one to begin with because I've done it and I'm familiar and I know what to expect. I know what the space has got to be like. So I don't want to do anything too crazy when I'm first starting a new place. I'm going to run Den of Wolves in Columbus, Ohio. So that's just about 4 hours from here. That's going to be in April. There is a super small local convention that's going to come to Louisville in January, and I thought I'm going to work with those guys to run a slimmed down version of Den of Wolves. Maybe we do like a 4-hour, like 25-person game just to get a feel for it, to see what it's like at a really local convention. Because I've never done it before, so it's a little experimental. I might turn up on the day and there's nobody there. I'm like, okay, well, we'll just go to the rest of the convention, I suppose. I don't know, is what it boils down to. That's hopefully that's in January. Gen Con is in August, and in August I'll probably do Gods of the Ancient World, and then maybe a couple of others, but I need to talk to the whole team about that one. And then the ones that I can control, the really cool new stuff, I'm going to run Deep Haven, which is Trenton. I think you've had him on the podcast before, right? Trenton Grey Oak.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to run Deep Haven here in Louisville in March. At the last Gen Con, someone needed to take his components home because he was flying. And I was like, I'll take your components home. So I've got his giant Jenga tower and his giant whiteboard. I was like, I might as well use them if I've got them.
Yeah.
Again, with the package, I know Trenton pretty well now. So it was not quite ready to be revealed. And I was like, sort of put a little pressure on him, like, please, could you get it ready for me? So I've been working with him to get that one. And then later on in the year, I'm going to... I had a couple of conversations with Jim Wallman, who saw my Watch the Skies version that I ran last year. And he had an observation that the pictures that I had taken did not look like Watch the Skies. And so we had a conversation where I was saying the things that I had changed, and I explained why. And he made he asked me to not use the name Watch the Skies anymore. I was like, okay, that's fine. It's his IP, and I did change it. There's an argument about, when does Watch the Skies not become Watch the Skies? But that's not my decision to make. That's his, so that's fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the work I did on it the first time, tweak it even more, remove any of the stuff that is his and all the language and that kind of stuff, and make a copy of it, if you like First Contact and like all the other versions of Watch the Skies. So I've decided I'm going to do this sort of series of games that all begin with the words "it came from." So I'm going to do "it came from the skies," "it came from outer space," "it came from the center of the earth," and so all it means is, the whole. Oh yes, I love it. All that means is, like I just use what I've already got, the sort of same structure, and I make that a standard package, and then you sort of bolt on modules to it, which are the story drivers. So, whether it's something from the deep, and it's like Atlantis Rising or something, or if it's something from Mars, or if it's something from another dimension, whatever it is, it's those stories that drive the whole game. And so I'm gonna do like a similar kind of one to begin with, called "It Came from the Skies" later this year, later next year, excuse me.
So,
And
so it
then,
sounds like next year is going to be pretty quiet then.
well, there's one more. And I
Um,
have you guys to thank for this, and that is
oh.
It Belongs in a Museum.
Ah, yeah.
Oh, I know. Oh, yeah. So I heard Nelly and her team
Mm.
talk about this on your podcast, and I was like, what a great mega game theme. Holy cow. It's just, I don't, and I've spoke to the two designers. I think there's three of them, but I've been talking to two of them, these Brits from the northeast of England, and they're so humble, and they have no idea, like, how great their theme is. They just have
Yeah.
no idea. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, and the work they've put into it, the writing that they've done, is huge. And so I've been working with them, and I remember from the episode that you ran with them that Nelly and her team had put a bunch of work into adding more factions, because the original game was only like a 28 or 30 player game or something, which is a lowercase m in megagames, and the Aussies put in some work to add extra factions, and so they got it up to like 34 or something like that. And so I've talked to these guys and said, I would love for you to add even more, because it's sort of like diminishing returns on cost at a certain point when you're running a mega game. So if I'm going to buy a package and I've got to buy the room anyway, and I've got to do all the advertising for it anyway, like, the more people I can get to that game, the better. So we're going to add like another 2 adventurer teams. We're going to add one more museum team. So we're going to get to a little bit over. We'll get to 40 something by the end of it, which is much more closer to like in my mind, a in quote standard size mega game.
Right.
Yep.
Awesome. Sounds absolutely stacked.
Yeah, a lot to do, but the nice thing is all these are games that are already written, so I just have to learn them now, produce the components for them. I don't have to work on the design. That's a massive amount of work off my shoulders. I have got designs in the works, but those will come secondary to next year.
Yeah, nice. It sounds like there could be some future conversations there with you, Tony, about the art of running someone else's game, because I think it's something a lot of us in Australia are starting to look at a bit more. I know Melbourne does it quite a bit in the past, but we're starting to look at that in Sydney too, and that whole packaging things up, dissecting them, knowing what to change and what not to. Where does it become too much work? It's a whole other little genre of the running things here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's like a whole different way of thinking about a game too. Designing is one thing because it's all in your head and you know what you can change and what you can't. But running someone else's is like, oh, why did they make this decision? Like, what's the rationale behind this balance? It seems weird, And the only way you can find that out is either by running it or by asking the designer themselves.
Well, we better wrap things up, I think. Thank you so much for coming on, Tony. This has been absolutely awesome. Where can people find you, and where can they go to find Gods of the Ancient World?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Gods of the Ancient World is available on my website, as well as all my tickets are going to go up on my website. That is dukesofhighland.net, Dukes of Highland.net. I'm on all the Discords. You can find me, just Tony. I'm on all of them. And I don't really like Facebook and Twitter and all those things. So my email list is the best way to stay abreast of games and what we're up to. I send out about a monthly email to folks saying like what games are upcoming next, when tickets are first on sale. My email list gets to know first as a thank you to sticking with me through thick and thin. So yeah, my website, dukesofhighland.net, excuse me. And all my blogs are on there as well, so you can read through all my all the design decisions for Gods of the Ancient World.
Excellent. And we will have
Fantastic.
links to the website and to the game itself, as well as a few other things like the video that you made of that game. So we'll have all those links connected to this episode.
Awesome.
Thanks again, Tony, and good luck next year. Maybe we'll need to catch up with you again soon.
Thanks very much. Yep, look forward to it.